today is Professor Dr. Maria A. Pozza. Dr. Maria is the Director and Principal Lawyer of Gravity Lawyers, a law firm in New Zealand that provides specialist legal advisory services in space law. Gravity Lawyers also provides advice on cybersecurity, IT data, UAVs, and risk assessment. Dr. Maria has been appointed as the director of the Otago Foreign Policy School and sits as a committee member of the National Security School. She is the Springer Series editor in Space Law and Policy. The most recent publication was on risk management in outer space activities, an Australian and New Zealand perspective. Her most recent award was in late 2021 from AI Global as the most influential woman in the aerospace law 2021. I welcome you, ma'am, for the session.
Thank you very much for inviting me to today's session. And look, thank you very much to you, the audience, for joining us today on this really, really important topic. Now, I'm going to try and keep my presentation brief because I know that time is not our friend. We don't have a lot of time together. So something that I would like to look at with you today is supply chain over the manufacturing of space assets and what that means from an international legal context and how our private organisations are operating within that context. Now, as you've already heard from previous speakers, we're seeing more and more changes in the space industry, and that's through the increase of non-state actor participation, or put another way, the increase in private actors wishing to utilise space in order to offer more varied commercial services. And we're certainly seeing much change to this arena, especially in the low Earth orbit, with more and more private entities wishing to utilise LEO, that's the low Earth orbit, because it offers so many varied opportunities. For example, it's cheaper to get into the low Earth orbit than, for example, the GEO orbit, that's the geostationary orbit, situated at approximately 33,000 kilometres away, compared to the low Earth orbit, which is between 80 to 120 kilometres away from the Earth's surface. So when we look at it in this perspective, you certainly don't need as much rocket fuel to enter the low Earth orbit. And so it's a lot cheaper. And look, it's also closer to Earth. So it means that telemetry systems do not need to travel that far out into space in order to communicate with satellites. So effectively, you can offer the same services in LEO as you might do in the geostationary orbit, which is further away and far more costly to see, and something that my practice has seen more and more entities entering. Now, look, not only that, in the low Earth orbit, you can utilise smaller technology, such as small satellites or nanosatellites, as a result of a number of things. But a few things is the proximity, the closeness of that orbit to the Earth's atmosphere. But not only that, you don't need those assets, those small sats and those nanosatellites, to have the longevity of life as other space other space objects might need to have in, for example, the geostationary orbit, because they need to be a hell of a lot larger when they're over there and far more robust in their framework, in their materials, in order to operate. So we're certainly seeing an increase in space actors joining the commercial space service sector. But what does this mean for supply chains and the manufacturing of space assets? We will see certainly more space products being manufactured. And in the wake of COVID, we're going to see more challenges. And we can expect to certainly see more challenges for both our government enterprises and private space actors that are undertaking commercial services in space. So look, it's important to remember the context when thinking about supply chains and when we're talking about space assets, the development of product and the manufacturing of product. So in context, what do I mean by that? Well, we know that space programs or activities usually require intensive capital and workforce resources. They're heavily research and design dependent. Componentry such as metals, electronics and wiring are critical to the space industry. So it is fair to assess that there is a wide range of materials, capabilities, and labour required in developing and producing space assets or or objects, or whatever those things may be that are necessary to complete the end product, the space object that's going to be utilised in outer space. So the supply chain that we're seeing now in this post-2020 world, this post-COVID world, has certainly become very wide, diverse, global, and complex. And from a holistic view, one would assume that the supply chain would be transparent. Perhaps it should ought to really be integrated as well between partners of the supply chain, especially when we're developing and manufacturing products for outer space. But in reality, that's not necessarily the case. Partners do not easily give out their commercial information to one another. They don't necessarily share that information easily. They jealously guard their intellectual property, and certainly they don't share in any shape or form any transparency over inventory or their technological developments, perhaps even those things that they're working on. So we also know then, when we take this into account in the context in which we're operating in today, is that whilst partners in the supply chain are probably unlikely to freely share information with each other, sometimes they literally cannot share information with each other, even if they wanted to, because of the contractual matrix that surrounds the development of their items, or perhaps their manufacturing or product. They may have contracts in place that requires them to keep confidentiality with other supply chain partners, especially when using componentry from other partners to create or develop something. So already we've got a big transparency issue, and we've got a big integration issue. We put that into this blender of COVID, and then we look at it through the context of international law and national and domestic law, and we look at our supply chain and try and figure out, well, what exactly is the regulatory framework in place, and how do we make risk assessments when we have so many varied regulations and legislations, as well as international law, in place governing these activities? So we have a huge strain now on our supply chain partners. Plus, we have to take into account that there's likely to be prime contractors as well. Now, those are the type of contractors that are sitting at the apex. During the Cold War, it was necessarily the case that the US and former Soviet Union were probably those prime contractors, in the sense that when they were developing space objects or assets, their supply chain was probably quite short, because it may have only really have involved maybe only 2 or 3 other nation states, and under very, very, very stringent communications. Whereas now, with the advent of more private entities coming to the market, our supply chains are becoming broader, they're becoming wider. We're seeing more and more partners joining supply chains from many, many different nation states across the globe. So we can already see now that we're getting raw materials for some of our space objects from India, perhaps, maybe even China, maybe even Thailand, and all sorts of places, as well as Africa. And we're then getting our telemetry services from other nations like the US, perhaps South Africa, even Australia. And we're seeing more and more fun things happening in the way of launches, with more private entities joining the space race. For example, from New Zealand, we can launch now from here. And we're seeing more of those private entities looking at Luxembourg and in a variety of other places as well. So again, I can't emphasize that point enough, that the supply chain is becoming wider, more varied, and far more complex. It's also, as a result of this, far more open to risk. Now, each partner in a supply chain necessarily brings value. And so perhaps some partners bring more value than other partners in the supply chain, but there is always value. Now, the problem that we're seeing, especially now in this post-COVID world in supply chains for space assets, is that we've got the commercial industry that has seen such a rapid development of technology, of new partners entering the space market, that we have this lack of prime contractor leadership position. Whereas before in the Cold War, it may have been the US or the former Soviet Union. We've now got private entities that are engaging with other private entities to the exclusion of nation states, although operating under those national domestic laws. But we don't necessarily have a prime contractor in the sense of that one entity that is overseeing the whole myriad of supply chain that is happening between the partners. So what does that mean? Well, I mentioned risk a little bit earlier, and with bigger, wider, complex supply chains, we've got risk of volatility from crises such as COVID-19. What we have is delays in manufacturing thereafter. People can't go into work and manufacture items anymore, so there's a delay. We can't get things shipped over to other nations, there's more delay. When things arrive at other nations, things have to be quarantined and treated, more delay. And sometimes what we also see as well with our private entities is because they don't have the taxpayers' money supporting them, a lot of them tend to go out of business. And it becomes very problematic when you have just one private actor who provides just one element of that supply chain, but perhaps there isn't anyone else that can do it. And if there is someone else, we often find that that partner has to be found from the other side of the globe. So that just creates more delays, and delays cost money, especially for private entities. It means that a lot of launchers, for example, now have to engage and make sure that as part of their risk assessment, they have dummy payloads. That's where you have a payload that you would put onto a launch vehicle that is the same weight, size, and of dimension that your actual payload should have been, because the launchers have undertaken some really big calculations in order to understand and put in enough rocket fuel to get those assets into outer space. So if you have one payload missing, suddenly the balance is completely out of whack and you can't launch. So having dummy payloads has been a way in which many commercial entities have tried to mitigate the risk that they may cause to a launcher. You'll find a lot of you who are students, and if you do go into the space industry as a lawyer, you'll find that having dummy payloads is a way in which your client will try and mitigate the cost they might face as a result of a failed launch because their payload wasn't ready. So we're seeing a lot of this. We're seeing a lot of gaps. We're seeing a lot of risk, and we're seeing a lot of delays. So when we then think of our supply chain in a holistic way and think about our supply chain operating under international law and domestic law, we've got more problems. Under international law, principally, international law applies to nation states. So it then means that we are heavily reliant on our nation states to implement very strong, very solid domestic law that provides some key oversights over those activities that private entities are engaging in. For example, a private entity will need to apply for a license or permit in order to undertake an activity in outer space, perhaps even launch from a nation state under the auspices of that framework. But the problem that we then have is we have conflict of laws when we only have private entities engaging with each other globally to an extent at the exclusion of international law, because they're all working under the auspices of their respective domestic national law, and then they engage in contracts whereby the contract might say this contract is governed by the laws of Australia, the laws of India, the laws of England. And we get into really, really big trouble when we have big crises that happen like COVID-19 and a lot of supply chain partners trying to utilize force majeure provisions. A force majeure is something that is beyond the control of the party within the contract. And so they try and rely on that in order to mitigate any risk of huge compensation that they may be liable to pay to the other party of a contract. So we're seeing more and more reliance then on these force majeure provisions. But the problem is that it causes more and more delay. And as a result of that delay, it causes big delays, not only for the launcher in the nation state, but for civil aviation as well. And it causes more delays thereafter for other payload partners who might also be using the same launch at the same time. So I think what you can already see from my very, very long rant here is that there is a big problem with supply chains, especially when we look at private entities. And really the crux of the problem is the lack of governance. It's the lack of structure that we see because of this burgeoning development of technology. And let's face it, law cannot keep up with technology, and we shouldn't ask the law to do that. Technology must be able to rapidly develop in the way that it can, because lots of great inventions have come from space, for example, the MRI. So we've got this balancing act that we need to take into account, and we need to ask ourselves, when we're undertaking supply chain analysis across global partners in the private sector, there needs to really be a prime contractor. And that's the person, or like the entity, the private entity, that's overseeing the entire supply chain. Now, I've seen instances where partners have got together and they have decided that they will engage an independent person or independent entity to oversee the supply chain. Whilst that's all good and well, the problem is that costs money. And who will pay for it? Will each of the partners pay for it and share in the cost? Not all partners will be willing to do that. So there's a couple of things that I've seen happen in large and complex supply chains at the moment. I am looking at the time. So I'm going to just very quickly just share my final thoughts as to things that we might hope to see in the future for better governance structures for supply chains, so that they can keep allowing the development of technology to keep happening and try and mitigate those exposures to risks that we see with wide and varied supply chains. So first of all, as I say, it might be that we implement an independent private entity, but that costs money. It could be that we look for our contracts to be far more uniform across partners. The problem with that, though, is that each of those contracts are working within their own nation state. So they're subject to their own national laws, as well as their nation's international legal obligations. So that's also problematic. Something else that really could be a great way of going about this is to think about a new framework for our private entities, whereby they can share more information between each other transparently, but in a secure manner, whereby intellectual property is protected, as is confidentiality. Now, that will take a lot of trust, and it's a huge trust and confidence building measure between private entities. I don't know if we're ready for that just yet, but from what I've seen thus far in the industry, I think that's the way we're going to have to head as more and more private entities join the space sector. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you this evening from New Zealand. I hope that you have a really wonderful conference, and my heartfelt thanks to the conference organisers for putting together a really splendid conference and for the invitation to speak with you today. Thank you very much.